Yusaf Akbar is a full professor of management at the Central European University in Vienna, and he is a visitor professor of international business management and emerging markets at MIB Trieste School of Management. He has a wide experience in teaching, research, and consultant, and he is an advisor to the European Commission, to other governmental authorities, and to various multinational companies. He has published articles, case studies, 4 books, and he is the founding editor of the International Journal of Emerging Markets. Professor, so given the post-pandemic context and the current geopolitical situation, can we predict the end of globalization as we know it? Or will the benefits of the trade exchanges return to overcome the tensions between states and people?
That's a great question. So I think what we're seeing today is an evolution of what we've experienced in the last 20 years, at least since the turn of this century. I think one of the big differences today is that while the period of globalization from, say the mid-1990s to just before the global financial crisis was more or less driven by one or maybe 2 major sort of economic powers. By that I mean the United States and the European Union. When we look at the world economy today, I think we're seeing a much more complex multipolar world, economically speaking, so that the centers of power, I think, are distributed differently. So, for want of simplicity, you've got a group of countries, European Union, United States, which are still more or less committed to this notion of sort of free trade and investment. But now you have a new set of countries, India, China, who are not necessarily as committed to the same set of rules that perhaps we were used to. And I think this multipolarity makes it much more difficult to maintain the kinds of economic relationships that we've had in the past. Then you add on top, of course, the role of the pandemic. So, this was the first pandemic in a century. It brought the world economy to a halt very quickly. But what we actually saw was a very resilient world. So we were able to respond actually really very quickly, largely because of many of the digitization tools that we have at our disposal. But I think what may have happened, certainly if you look at a corporate level, so looking at companies, is a realization that many of the global value chains that had been developed in the period before weren't very resilient, right? So they were very long, but they didn't have much ability to deal with shocks. And I think the COVID pandemic is teaching companies how to develop much more flexible and resilient value chains than we had before. So I think in summary, globalization, I think, is going to stay, but I think it's going to take a different form. I think it will be less guaranteed. So I think there'll be times in which countries will become more protectionist. I mean, we're beginning to see some of that in certain key technologies such as semiconductors, access to lithium, cobalt for the development of electric batteries for an emerging car industry. But I think the architecture of the international trading system will largely remain as it is.
So in today's evolving market, is it still appropriate to talk about emerging markets? Could you tell us what are the key interpretations and main angles of analysis in your upcoming book on emerging markets?
So the concept of emerging markets develops around the turn of the last century. It was an idea that was developed at the International Finance Corporation, which is the division of the World Bank. And it really was trying to draw people's attention, and investors in particular, their attention to these new markets which were growing at a much faster rate than the developed economies. And so the first group of emerging markets that we spent a lot of time talking about, particularly in the first decade of the century, were countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China. And then, as the decade continued and we entered the second decade, I think we extended our analysis to places like Nigeria, Indonesia, Vietnam, Turkey, Egypt, and so on. I think we're now at a stage where, if you look at parts of China, you look at the big coastal cities of China, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen. These are fundamentally developed economies, right? They have income levels similar to what you'd expect in developed economies. They have infrastructure, which in some cases is actually superior to infrastructure we see in traditional developed economies. So I think the notion that there are these emerging markets and that all we have to do is take our investment and put them in these countries and they're going to grow and provide corporate growth is not as given as it was. So I think we're all struggling, frankly, to come up with a new concept that replaces emerging markets. Personally, I'm becoming more convinced of the fact that just because you're growing fast as a country, it doesn't guarantee you get to the end of the line where you become a developed economy. The other day, someone asked me, how many countries in the last half century have gone from being poor to rich? And I literally had to struggle. Came up with 5 countries. So United Arab Emirates, Ireland, Taiwan, Singapore, right? So very few countries, Korea. There are a lot of countries that are emerging markets that get stuck. They become what we call middle income countries. And the reasons for that are very complex, right? So, I couldn't say there's a single explanation for becoming a middle-income country, but I think as we move forward in the next decade, I think China is going to become an established, industrialized economy, right? So it joins the top table, it joins the United States, it joins the European Union, it gains that sort of recognition. And I think India is very, very fast behind. And as a final thought here, I think it's interesting to note that, you've got companies in China now that are world-leading companies. So you think about Huawei and telecoms equipment space. You think about some of these Chinese digital firms like ByteDance, the creators of TikTok. I mean, these are companies that are not emerging. They set the standard for everyone else to follow. So I think we need to be much more nuanced and much more thoughtful about the notion of emerging markets, which brings me to the book that you mentioned. It's basically a book which will provide a kind of tour d'horizon of what we mean by emerging markets. So it's going to talk about where the idea came from, how it's developed, and then look at key specific areas in emerging markets. So we're going to talk about things like entrepreneurship in emerging markets. We're going to talk about things like infrastructure, digitization in emerging markets. And we're going to try and build a kind of a nuanced but broad picture of what we mean by that concept.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.